Okay, let's unpack this. The geopolitical chessboard. Well, it just got a lot more intense, didn't it?
It really did.
On Friday, June 13th, you had Israel launching an airstrike on Iran. And almost immediately, President Trump weighed in.
Right, with that comment about it being not too late for Tehran to negotiate its nuclear program.
Which, on the surface, sounds like maybe an opening, a step towards talks.
Perhaps, but then you get the contrast, almost instantly. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu saying the strikes were about bringing freedom.
And that's where our sources jump in, highlighting this massive tension. They're calling it bullying dressed up as negotiation.
And a shameful moment, especially as they point out, because this happened right in the middle of ongoing nuclear discussions.
So you have these two things, diplomacy supposedly on the table, and military action framed as liberation, happening at the same time.
Exactly. And that's what we want to get into this deep dive. We need to move past just the headlines. We've looked at a lot of different sources, and the aim here is to really understand the history, the motivations, what's really driving this.
And the consequences, too. They could be huge globally.
Absolutely. So for you listening, our goal is to cut through that noise and try to get to what's really at stake here.
Okay, so let's start with the immediate event itself. That Israeli strike on Iran, June 13th.
The sources we've looked at, they really question the stated reasons behind it.
Yeah, one perspective was pretty blunt, calling it hypocrisy from Israel and the U.S.
The idea being, how can you talk about humanitarian aims while actively bombing another country's infrastructure?
And the timing, as you mentioned, during nuclear talks between Washington and Tehran. That's key.
It really is. The commentary frames it specifically as that bullying dressed up as negotiation.
Implying the talks might have been, what? A cover?
Or at least that the attack was planned regardless. Using the talks almost as a backdrop for coercion, it forces you to ask.
What was the real goal?
Yeah. Was it actually about changing the regime? Or was it more about, as some sources suggest, forcing Iran, a sovereign nation, to essentially submit?
That's a crucial question. And it leads into this narrative shift that happened very quickly.
The victim narrative.
Exactly. Our sources point out Israel now plays the victim, even while Iran is under attack and Netanyahu is calling for Iranians to overthrow their own government.
Which naturally brings us to Iran's perspective, and specifically their pursuit of nuclear capabilities. Why would they do that?
And you can't understand that without looking at the history, can you?
Not at all. The analyses we've seen state Iran's motivation pretty clearly. They want to stop what they see as a decades-long cycle of sanctions, sabotage, assassinations, and attacks.
Which they attribute to the U.S. and Israel.
Correct. And this isn't new. It goes way back. Think about the 1953 coup, CIA and MI6 involved against Prime Minister Mossadegh.
A democratically elected leader.
Yes. Yeah. And then, fast forward to the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War.
A truly devastating conflict.
And during that war, Iran was hit with chemical weapons, weapons provided or backed by Western powers.
And the irony, the sources point out, is that Saddam Hussein, who used those weapons.
He was the West's ally at the time. As part of this long, long history, Iran sees as constant foreign interference and aggression.
So for Iran, it becomes, as the sources put it, a matter of pride.
Exactly. It's a psychological element, too. I mean, can a nation with such a deep history, Cyrus the Great, Avicenna, this incredible past, tolerate what they perceive as constant humiliation?
Probably not.
So the argument presented is, if self-defense against these threats means getting nuclear weapons, then, well, so be it.
Even if it goes against the grain of the quote-unquote international community.
Especially when that community is seen, rightly or wrongly, as allowing Israel to have its own nuclear arsenal and attack neighbors for, nearly 80 years now, without major repercussions.
That perceived double standard sends a powerful signal, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and it connects to a broader, quite sobering warning mentioned in the sources.
Which comes from Netanyahu himself.
Yes, a past statement. If Israel falls, the world falls.
And the interpretation offered is unsettling, that it might be hinting at the Samson option.
So let's clarify what that is. The Samson option, it's essentially Israel's rumored, unofficial doctrine.
Named after the biblical story.
Right. If Israel's existence is fundamentally threatened, the plan is supposedly massive nuclear retaliation against its enemies. No holds barred.
Bringing the temple down on everyone, so to speak.
Precisely. And Israel is estimated to have, around 400 nuclear warheads? So the capability is there.
But the sources suggest it might go beyond just traditional nukes.
This is where it gets, quite chilling. There's this warning highlighted from former Israeli Defense Minister Naftali Bennett.
What did he suggest?
He hinted that if Israel felt truly cornered, the consequences wouldn't just be regional. They could be global, systemic failures.
How so? Like a hidden kill switch?
That's the concept, embedded in critical global systems. Things we rely on every day, medical devices, cybersecurity, major tech platforms, even apps like Waze, maritime navigation systems.
Because so many use Israeli code or technology.
Exactly. The picture painted is stark. One click, and the world goes dark.
Wow, that's quite a thought.
And it's not pure fantasy. You look at things like Stuxnet, that incredibly sophisticated cyber weapon that hit Iran's nuclear program.
Or those Lebanese pager attacks more recently. Major disruption.
These are presented as potential indicators, maybe even warnings, of these kinds of capabilities. It suggests Israel's security posture isn't just military,
It's digital, too, woven into the fabric of our modern world.
making an existential threat to Israel potentially catastrophic for everyone, digitally speaking.
Okay, so that's the extreme end, the potential for utter devastation. But amidst all this, there's a really interesting counter-argument we need to bring in.
Yes, the one put forward by Kenneth Waltz.
The scholar Kenneth Waltz, yeah. In that 2012 Foreign Affairs piece, Why Iran Should Get the Bomb. A pretty provocative title.
Highly provocative. But Waltz's theory, rooted in realism, is basically that states want to survive. And in an uncertain world, nuclear weapons are the ultimate survival guarantee.
The ultimate deterrent.
Exactly. And counterintuitively, he argued, this deterrence can actually create stability.
Are there examples of this working?
Well, the sources point to North Korea. After getting nuclear weapons, the argument goes Pyongyang actually became more cautious. It even led President Trump to the negotiating table.
Interesting.
Or look at India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers with deep hostility. But their conflicts, they've mostly been contained to minor strikes. Why? Nuclear deterrence makes full-scale war unthinkable.
Even Pakistan, which has faced issues with extremism, acts rationally with its nukes.
That's the observation. The state itself acts rationally when the stakes are nuclear.
So, applying this to the Middle East, Waltz and those analyzing his work would say Israel's nuclear monopoly creates an imbalance.
Yes, potentially enabling unchecked aggression. The argument is that a nuclear Iran, even a limited one, would force more caution on all sides.
And it might change Iran's own behavior, maybe less reliance on proxies like Hamas or Hezbollah.
That's part of Waltz's theory. If your ultimate security rests on your own nuclear deterrent, you might rely less on potentially uncontrollable non-state actors.
Okay, but what about the big fear, the arms race? If Iran gets the bomb, won't Saudi Arabia be next?
That's the common critique. But the analysis we reviewed counters this. First, they suggest Saudi Arabia probably already has access, or at least a very quick path, to Pakistani nukes.
Because they funded Pakistan's program back in the 80s.
During the Soviet-Afghan War, yes. And apparently under the watchful eye of the U.S. at the time. Plus, historically, the argument goes, nuclear proliferation doesn't automatically trigger a regional race. Japan and South Korea didn't rush to build bombs when North Korea did.
Because deterrence kicks in, the cost is just too high.
That seems to be the pattern. Deterrence often cools ambitions. It doesn't necessarily ignite them further once established.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at some of these, frankly, quite disturbing long-term scenarios outlined in the research. What if Iran does fall?
Right, what happens then? The sources explore possibilities like Israel managing to install a more friendly government in Tehran.
How might that happen? Maybe through covert actions, false flag attacks blamed on Iran.
That's one scenario floated. Or escalating rhetoric. Think about Netanyahu's claim, which sources call an unproven accusation, that Iran wants to assassinate Trump. Could that be used as a pretext?
Leading to someone like Vice President J.D. Vance sending U.S. troops. It's a potential pathway.
A very volatile one. And then there's an even more explosive scenario discussed.
The Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Yes. Imagine its destruction, whether accidental or grimly intentional. The sources suggest the blame would likely fall squarely on Iran, losing Islam's third holiest site.
The political and religious fallout would be immense, turning the Sunni world against Shia Iran.
Potentially. Creating a massive sectarian divide, and crucially for some narratives, clearing the way for Israel to perhaps build its third temple.
Which isn't just a modern fantasy. You mentioned Israeli extremists plotted this back in the 80s.
They did. The sources warn that if something like the Temple Mount scenario unfolded, the entire Middle East could just collapse.
And the ambition might not stop at Iran. Netanyahu hinted, after Iran, nuclear-armed Pakistan could be next.
Which is deeply ironic, given, as the sources note, the history of secret ties between Israel and Pakistan, cooperating against the Soviets, sharing intelligence.
It all seems to point towards something bigger, what the research calls Israel's bigger plan.
Greater Israel vision. This isn't new. It's a concept, a dream for some, dating back to 1948.
Stretching from the Nile River in Egypt to the Euphrates in Iraq.
Exactly. Encompassing parts of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, even into the Gulf.
And Iran is seen as the main obstacle to this.
Consistently, yes. The sources state Iran has always blocked this vision. Remember General Wesley Clark after 9/11?
He revealed that Pentagon list. 7 countries targeted for regime change.
And Iran was the last one on that list. It reinforces this idea of a long-term strategy where Iran is the final major roadblock.
So this whole conflict, it's not just about nuclear weapons, is it?
According to this analysis, no. It's deeply tied to these broader territorial and religious ambitions.
And you mentioned specific figures, like Avi Lipkin.
Yes. Zionist figures cited in the sources who have openly discussed ideas like purifying Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities, and Mount Sinai.
That adds a whole other layer, not just land, but spiritual conquest, too.
It illustrates the intensity of both the territorial and the religious dimensions driving some of these aspirations.
And the chilling conclusion drawn in this section.
Once Israel controls the Middle East, it might challenge bigger powers. But first, Iran must fall.
Wow, okay. So wrapping this deep dive up, we've really peeled back a lot of layers here.
Immense complexity, definitely. You've got centuries of history, deep grievances, intricate geopolitics, powerful religious drives, and now this terrifying layer of advanced technology and cyber warfare potential.
It's all woven together: history, ideology, strategy.
A very dense tapestry.
So we have to leave you, the listener, with a final thought, really. Considering everything we've explored today, the depth of the history, the religious elements, the sheer strategic power plays.
Is genuine, lasting peace even possible in the Middle East without some kind of fundamental shift, a rethinking of these core narratives?
Or is conflict just inevitable until one side achieves total dominance? So something to really mull over.